Tens of thousands of exhausted soldiers moved slowly under the burning Philippine sun. Their bodies were already broken by hunger and disease, and now they were being forced to march again. Many of them would not survive the day. Some would fall from weakness. Others would be beaten or shot where they stood. This march was not meant to be survived. Among those prisoners was a young American officer named William E. Dyess. In April 1942, after the fall of Bataan, he became one of the captured Allied soldiers placed under Japanese control. What followed would become known as the Bataan Death March, one of the most brutal atrocities of the Second World War. For the men trapped inside it, survival depended on endurance, silence, and pure chance. Dyess watched fellow prisoners collapse from thirst and starvation. There was no mercy for those who could not keep moving. Guards struck without warning. Some prisoners were killed simply for slowing down or looking in the wrong direction. The road itself became a place of constant fear, where death could arrive at any moment. Most of the captured soldiers believed that if they could just reach the prison camps, the worst would be over. They believed captivity meant life. But the march was only the beginning. The camps would claim even more lives, quietly and relentlessly. William Dyess was not stronger than the others. He was not immune to hunger or pain. Yet somehow, he survived when so many did not. And later, when escape seemed impossible and silence felt safer, he chose to risk everything to make sure this story was never forgotten. Before he became a prisoner, before hunger and violence ruled his days, William Edwin Dyess lived a life shaped by discipline and duty. He was born in Texas, far from jungles and battlefields, in a country that still believed oceans could keep war away. Like many young Americans of his generation, Dyess grew up during hard times, learning resilience early and believing in service as a path forward. Dyess chose the military when the Army Air Forces were still young and evolving. He trained as an officer, learning leadership, responsibility, and control under pressure. Those who knew him described him as serious and professional, but not extraordinary. He was not famous. He was not a hero yet. He was simply doing his job. By the late 1930s, tensions were rising across the world, but for many American servicemen, war still felt distant. Dyess was stationed overseas as part of the U.S. presence in the Philippines, a territory considered vital to American defense in the Pacific. Life there followed routines, training, patrols, preparation, mixed with a quiet uncertainty about what might come next. When news arrived of the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, everything changed overnight. The war Dyess had trained for but never experienced had suddenly become real. The Philippines were no longer a distant outpost. They were now a target. William Dyess entered the war as a trained officer with faith in preparation and command. He could not yet know that none of that would protect him from what was coming. The rules he understood were about to disappear. Only hours after Pearl Harbor was attacked, the war arrived in the Philippines. Japanese aircraft filled the skies, striking American airfields with speed and precision. Many U.S. planes were destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. The sense of shock was overwhelming. The enemy was not coming. The enemy was already there. William Dyess and his fellow servicemen were thrown into a desperate defensive fight. Supplies were limited. Reinforcements never came. The Japanese advance was fast and relentless, pushing American and Filipino forces back again and again. What had once been a confident defense plan quickly turned into a struggle just to hold ground. As the weeks passed, Allied forces were forced to retreat toward the Bataan Peninsula. Each withdrawal meant abandoning equipment, food, and wounded men. Roads became crowded with soldiers and civilians fleeing the same direction. Confusion spread, and morale began to break under the pressure of constant attack. The Japanese controlled the air and sea. Allied troops on Bataan were cut off from resupply. Food rations were reduced again and again. Men grew weaker with each passing day. Malaria and dysentery spread through the ranks, turning simple exhaustion into life-threatening illness. Dyess watched the strength of his unit slowly drain away. Training and discipline could not replace food or medicine. Yet orders were clear: Bataan had to be held as long as possible. Every day of resistance mattered, even as hope faded. By early 1942, the defenders of Bataan were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to delay the inevitable. And with each passing week, the cost of that delay was paid in human lives. By the beginning of 1942, hunger had become the enemy that never left. Food supplies on Bataan were almost gone. Daily rations were cut to a fraction of what a soldier needed to survive. Men lost weight rapidly. Their uniforms hung loose on bodies that were slowly shutting down. William Dyess felt his strength fading day by day. Soldiers searched the jungle for anything they could eat. Wild plants, roots, even animals meant nothing now. Hunger controlled every thought. It weakened discipline and crushed morale more effectively than bombs ever could. Disease spread quickly among the starving troops. Malaria, dysentery, and fever filled the field hospitals, which had no medicine left to give. Doctors could only watch as men wasted away. Many soldiers were too weak to stand, yet they were still expected to fight. The Japanese knew exactly what they were doing. By cutting off supplies, they turned starvation into a weapon. Every passing day made resistance harder. Every meal skip pushed the defenders closer to collapse. By April 1942, it was clear the situation was hopeless. Allied forces on Bataan were exhausted, sick, and barely able to hold their rifles. Commanders faced an impossible choice: continue fighting and watch their men die, or surrender and trust the enemy to follow the rules of war. For William Dyess and thousands of others, surrender felt like the only way to survive. None of them knew that the worst suffering of their lives was about to begin. The march started under a blazing sun, with thousands of prisoners packed tightly together on dusty roads. William Dyess could feel the heat rising from the ground with every step. Many men had not eaten properly in weeks. Some had not drunk clean water in days. Now they were expected to walk for miles without rest. Japanese guards lined the roads, rifles and bayonets always visible. They shouted orders in a language most prisoners did not understand. Anyone who slowed down was struck. Anyone who fell was kicked. The pace never stopped. Thirst quickly became unbearable. Prisoners passed wells and streams, but drinking was forbidden. Men who broke ranks to reach water were beaten or killed in front of everyone else. Dyess watched helplessly as soldiers collapsed from dehydration, their bodies unable to take another step. The march stretched on hour after hour. There was no shelter from the sun. Feet blistered and bled. Uniforms were soaked with sweat and dust. The smell of sickness and fear filled the air. Each step forward felt heavier than the last. Some prisoners tried to help fallen comrades, lifting them to their feet or supporting their weight. Guards responded with violence, striking both men without hesitation. Survival became an individual struggle. Kindness could get you killed. By the end of the first day, the road was already marked by bodies. The prisoners were learning a brutal truth. This was not a transfer. This was a test of endurance designed to break them. And the march had only just begun. As the days passed, the rules of the march became clear. There were none. Death came without warning and without reason. Japanese guards killed prisoners not for escape attempts, but for weakness, for confusion, and sometimes for nothing at all. William Dyess saw men executed on the side of the road after simple misunderstandings, a wrong turn, a delay in movement, and a look that lasted too long. The guards used rifle butts, bayonets, and bullets freely. Each act of violence was meant to terrorize the rest into obedience. The prisoners learned to walk with their eyes down, their faces empty. Emotion was dangerous. Anger was fatal. Even grief had to be hidden. Friends who had marched together since the beginning vanished in moments, left behind on the road without ceremony. Bodies were not removed. The living was forced to step around the dead. The march continued past villages where civilians watched in silence, powerless to help. Some tried to offer food or water, but they were beaten away by guards. Dyess understood that survival now depended on awareness. He learned to sense danger before it arrived, to move when others hesitated, and to conserve strength while never appearing weak. Every hour was a calculation, every step a risk. The randomness of death was the hardest part. There was no logic to follow, no pattern to avoid. A man could survive one moment and be dead the next. And still, the road stretched on, with no end in sight. When the prisoners finally reached Camp O'Donnell, many believed they had survived the worst. The march was over. They expected rest, food, and medical care. Instead, they walked into another form of death. The camp was overcrowded and filthy. Thousands of prisoners were packed into a space never meant to hold them. There was almost no clean water. Food was scarce and poorly prepared. Disease spread faster than anyone could track it. Men who had survived the march now collapsed inside the camp within days. William Dyess watched death become routine. Bodies were carried out each morning, sometimes hundreds at a time. There were not enough doctors, not enough medicine, and no real effort to improve conditions. The guards showed little concern. Prisoners were replaceable. Weakness was everywhere. Men lay on the ground too sick to stand, waiting for help that never came. Some were so thin they no longer looked human. The sound of coughing and fevered voices filled the air day and night. Dyess realized a terrifying truth. Survival did not end with the march. In some ways, the camps were worse. There was no movement, no distraction, and no sense of progress. Only waiting to recover, or waiting to die. As the days passed, Dyess began to understand that staying in the camp meant trusting an enemy who had already shown no mercy. If nothing changed, the camp would kill him slowly. And that realization planted a dangerous thought. Not long after arriving at Camp O'Donnell, William Dyess was moved again. For the prisoners, transfers brought fear, not relief. Every move meant more uncertainty, more abuse, and more chances to disappear. The new camp was smaller, harsher, and more tightly controlled. Conditions were no better, and in some ways worse. Food rations were thin. Beatings were common. Prisoners whispered rumors about men being taken away and never returning. Dyess noticed that certain prisoners were singled-out officers. Men who asked questions. Men who looked too strong or too defiant. They were removed quietly, often at night. No explanations were given. Fear settled over the camp like a heavy fog. Prisoners avoided attention at all costs. Conversations were brief and cautious. Trust became dangerous. Anyone could be listening. Dyess began to believe that the Japanese were not just imprisoning them. They were slowly eliminating them one group at a time. A camp like this did not need executions in public. Time and neglect did the work just as well. As his health weakened and the disappearances continued, Dyess reached a conclusion that terrified him. Staying meant eventual death. Obedience would not save him. If he wanted to live, he would have to escape. The idea of escape was almost unthinkable. Japanese guards made it clear that any escape attempt would be punished with torture or death. Prisoners were warned that if one man escaped, others might suffer for it. Fear kept most men silent. William Dyess knew the risks. He also knew that remaining in the camp meant waiting to die. Each day his body grew weaker. Each night more prisoners disappeared. Hope itself became dangerous, but without it, there was nothing left. Dyess quietly connected with a small group of prisoners who felt the same. Trust was fragile. One wrong word could end everything. They spoke only when necessary, and never in the open. Every detail mattered: guard routines, weak points in the perimeter, moments of darkness. The plan was simple because it had to be. There would be no weapons. No second chances. If caught, there would be no trial, only violence. Timing was everything. They waited for a moment when the guards were distracted and the weather worked in their favor. Each delay increased the risk, but rushing could be fatal. As the chosen night approached, Dyess understood the final truth. Escape was not just about freedom. It was about choosing how to face death. On the road, in the camps, men had died without choice. This time, Dyess would decide. The night Dyess chose to escape was dark and quiet, too quiet. Every sound felt louder than it should be: a footstep and a breath. The rustle of clothing, and any mistake would bring the guards running. Moving slowly, Dyess slipped away from the camp. His body was weak from months of hunger and illness, but fear pushed him forward. There was no time to think about pain. Only movement mattered. The jungle closed in around him almost immediately. Thick vegetation blocked his view and tore at his skin. He could hear insects, distant voices, and the faint sounds of patrols. Each step had to be careful. One snap of a branch could end everything. Dyess did not know the exact direction to safety. He only knew he had to keep moving away from the camp. He walked when he could, crawled when he had to, and stopped often to listen. Sleep was impossible. Stopping for too long felt just as dangerous as moving. Hunger returned quickly. So did exhaustion. But the fear of capture was stronger than both. Dyess knew what happened to escapees. He had seen the bodies. By morning, he was deep in enemy territory, alone, unarmed, and hunted. The hardest part of his escape was over. Now came the most dangerous part, staying free. For days, William Dyess moved through the jungle, avoiding roads and open spaces. He survived on almost nothing. His strength faded quickly, and the risk of being discovered grew with every step. Japanese patrols were everywhere. Capture felt inevitable. Then, against all odds, Dyess found help. Filipino civilians and guerrilla fighters were quietly resisting the occupation. Helping an escaped prisoner was punishable by death, yet some chose to take that risk. When Dyess finally made contact, trust did not come easily. Fear ruled both sides. One wrong decision could cost many lives. The guerrillas hid Dyess, fed him, and guided him through territory controlled by the enemy. They moved only at certain times, using hidden paths and local knowledge to avoid patrols. Dyess depended on them completely. Without their help, he would not survive. Living in hiding brought a new kind of tension. Silence was constant. Fires were dangerous. Even speaking too loudly could draw attention. Dyess learned to wait, sometimes for days, without moving. Through these fighters, Dyess saw another side of the war and civilians risking everything, not for orders or medals, but to resist occupation. Their courage kept him alive. But freedom was still far away. The journey was not over. If anything, it had become longer and more uncertain. William Dyess remained in hiding for months. Each day brought the same danger. Japanese patrols searched villages and forests, looking for guerrillas and escaped prisoners. Dyess had to move carefully, never staying in one place for too long. The guerrillas guided him from one safe area to another. Travel was slow and exhausting. They avoided main roads, crossing rivers and mountains instead. Food was limited, and sickness was a constant threat. Even small injuries could become deadly. Dyess learned patience the hard way. Sometimes he waited for days before it was safe to move again. He listened for distant voices, gunfire, or the sound of boots on the ground. Every signal mattered. As time passed, Dyess began to regain some strength, but the fear never left. One mistake could undo everything. He knew that if captured again, there would be no second chance. Eventually, after a long and dangerous journey, Dyess reached an area controlled by Allied forces. For the first time since Bataan, he was no longer a prisoner or a fugitive. He was free. But freedom did not erase what he had seen. Dyess carried the memories of the march, the camps, and the men who never escaped. He understood that surviving was not enough. Someone had to speak. When William Dyess finally returned to Allied control, his body was free, but his mind was not. The memories of the Death March and the prison camps followed him everywhere. He knew that thousands of men were still suffering, and many were already dead. Dyess was debriefed by American officials. What he told them was difficult to hear. He described the beatings, the executions, the starvation, and the cruelty of the march. His testimony was one of the first detailed eyewitness accounts of what had happened after the fall of Bataan. At first, some struggled to believe him. The scale of the brutality seemed unreal. But Dyess insisted on telling the truth. He felt responsible for the men who could no longer speak for themselves. His account was shared with military leaders and later with the public. It shocked Americans back home and changed how the war in the Pacific was understood. The suffering of the prisoners was no longer hidden. Dyess had survived something meant to erase him. By speaking out, he made sure the crimes were recorded and remembered. His survival became more than personal. It became a warning. William E. Dyess did not live a long life after the war. Years of imprisonment, starvation, and illness had taken a lasting toll on his health. He died young, far earlier than he should have. But his story did not end with his death. Because Dyess chose to speak, the world learned the truth about the Bataan Death March. His testimony became a vital historical record, used to expose war crimes and to honor the men who never returned. Without voices like his, many of those deaths might have remained statistics, not human lives. Dyess represented thousands who endured suffering without recognition. He was not the only survivor, but he was one of the first to break the silence. His words ensured that the cruelty of the march could not be denied or forgotten. Today, his story reminds us that survival can be an act of resistance, that memory is a form of justice, and that even in the darkest moments of war, the truth can still find its way out. William E. Dyess was not supposed to live, but because he did, history remembers.